Hello and welcome back to another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast where we look back at the history of the week ahead and top that history lesson off with a song pairing too. I'm your host Adam, and over the next 50-ish minutes, we'll be looking at 7 historical stories that have piqued my interest from the coming week. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for another TDNY, as on this episode we learn why you shouldn't always listen to the radio, that the games have been rigged from the start, why open-air testing is maybe not the best option, and how you could get up to $250,000, plus a whole lot more along the way. So let's get started with Monday, the 10th of March. And on this day, not year, time was up for radio host Mildred Gillars. Born in Portland, Maine at the start of the 1900s, Mildred Elizabeth Sisk led a fairly uneventful life for the first 40 years of her life. Her parents divorcing and her mother remarrying saw her take up the surname Gillars, although life wasn't a happy one under her new stepfather. Mildred Gillars wanted to be an actress, and around the age of 18 even enrolled in a university to study the dramatic arts. She would eventually drop out at the bequest of a teacher, doing well in her drama but failing her other required studies. And she would move to New York. There she used the money earned from a string of jobs to pay for more drama classes, went on to act in vaudeville, and even toured with some established companies. But her acting career never really took off. Following a partner to Europe in the 1930s, eventually found her studying music in Germany, before becoming an English language teacher. She was in Germany during Hitler's rise to power, and despite requests from the American government for all US citizens to leave, she would stay. Possibly owing to the poor pay her teacher role gave, or maybe seeing it as one final chance to live up to her actress dreams, in 1940, during World War II, Mildred Gillars started a new job at the German State Radio Corporation. Although she didn't know it yet, soon she would be broadcasting out to more than just Germans. Starting off as an announcer and actor for broadcast plays, she soon caught the ear of Max Oskar Otto Keuschwitz, an ex-professor from New York who had fled the country after his pro-Nazi beliefs began to infect his teaching, and he started lecturing on anti-Semitic views. Although married, Max and Mildred soon began a relationship, Mildred's own fiancé having recently died on the front. Shortly after Max and Mildred met, Pearl Harbor was attacked and America would enter the war. This saw a shift in their radio presentation and their target audience. "Hello, gang! Throw down those little old guns and toddle off home. There's no getting the Germans down," Mildred blared out in one broadcast. Her show, the Home Sweet Home Hour, was targeted specifically at the American soldiers. It was her own shortwave warfare, bombarding the soldiers with patronizing messages about cheating wives or lovers back home, spewing propaganda about the German war machine and the horrific deaths awaiting the Americans, plus anti-Semitic rhetoric and/or attacks on the American and English leaders. To quote one of her rants, "I say damn Roosevelt and Churchill, and all of their Jews who have made this war possible." Although Mildred referred to herself often as Midge, this is Midge at the mic. The listening soldiers soon came up with other names for the American on the German radio. Berlin Babe was one, the Bitch of Berlin, a more crass suggestion, but it was another name that really stuck. Mildred, in one broadcast, referred to herself as the Irish type, a real Sally, and thus the moniker of Axis Sally was born. As for what the American soldiers thought about Axis Sally and her home sweet home hour, well, they loved it. Rather than coming off as intimidating, these soldiers would laugh along with Mildred, and really enjoyed the modern American music that she would play in between the taunts. The soldiers weren't the only Americans following the broadcast closely, as the FBI were making recordings too, building up their own case against Mildred Gillers. The most damning broadcast came on May 11th, 1944, in a dramatized play, written by Max, called Visions of Invasion. The play opened. The D of D-Day stands for doom, disaster, death, defeat, Dunkirk or Dieppe. Dunkirk and Dieppe being previous battles, conveniently starting with the letter D, that saw many deaths among the Allied soldiers, which was exactly what the play was about. A large-scale invasion into Europe by the massing Allied forces, only for them to be repulsed and suffer heavy losses. In the play, Mildred plays an American mother, visited by her dead son in a dream, as he tells her of the horrors of war. This broadcast was meant to dissuade the real-life gathering forces of soldiers in England, hopefully diverting any attack. It wouldn't work. 26 days later, the D-Day operation commenced and a large-scale invasion force landed on the beaches of Normandy. The Nazi army, knowing of the invasion, had predicted the wrong location. It was the beginning of the end for the Axis powers and for Axis Sally. She would continue her broadcast right up until May 6, 1945, 6 days after Hitler's death and 2 days before the Nazis would surrender. Although she had continued, her final broadcasts lacked the fire of her earliest, as, in August 1944, the year prior, her American co-conspirator and lover, Max Koischwitz, had died. Along with Max, any chance of marriage and becoming a German citizen had died too. So, after the war, after the loss of both Max and the loss Germany suffered, Axis Sally, Mildred Gillers, was a broken woman. She changed her name yet again and went into hiding, blending in with all the other refugees in Germany after the war. In 1946, she was recognized and arrested by members of the Army Intelligence Corps. Held in a military jail in Germany, she was eventually released in December of the same year, but requested to stay a while longer in jail so she could spend Christmas fed and with shelter. All before being arrested again shortly after and sent back to America to be charged with treason. Facing 10 counts, eventually pushed down to 8, on this day in 1949, Mildred Elizabeth Gillers, aka Axis Sally, was found guilty of 1 count of treason for producing and starring in the Visions of Invasion play, and was sentenced to up to 30 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. She would go on to serve 12 years before slipping back into a quiet life on her release, passing away in 1988. On her death, media descending to her home, neighbors were shocked to find the quiet lady in the house next door had been the first woman charged with treason in America. The more things change, the more they stay the same. While Mildred Gillers was an American spouting Nazi propaganda in the 1940s, there's still many doing the exact same today. Just as Mildred used one of the most advanced media platforms of the day, now many, spurred on by the site owner's own Nazi endorsements, use the website formerly known as Twitter to spew propaganda to a new audience. We can only hope their messages are met the same way, with mocking laughter. Finding a fitting song for this story was a challenge, but I think I've found the perfect pairing. The 1978 hit by Australian rock band The Sports with Who Listens to the Radio? A question I'm sure all the soldiers were asking themselves as Axis Sally was pouring out the propaganda. Who listens to the radio? That's what I want to know. Tuesday, 11th of March, and on this day, not year, Charles Van Doren had been on a hot streak, but his luck couldn't go on forever. Let's take a look at how it all started. Tonight, here on 21, Herbert Stempel, our 29-year-old GI college student, can win $111,500, the highest amount of money ever won on television. But to do this, he is risking much of the money he has won so far. So, right now, let's meet our first two players. The quiz show host for 21, Jack Barry, announced to the audience on December 5th, 1956. Bringing out the players from last week, Herbert Stempel and Charles Van Doren. Their previous game had ended in a tie, but tonight would be different. The players just knew it. 21 was an early television game show, back in the infancy of the genre, and the television, that saw contestants wagering points, between 1 to 11, and being asked a question of corresponding difficulty. 1 was the easiest, while 11 risked the hardest questions. The aim, to get to 21 points first. Game shows of this era had no regulations outside of the one rule that contestants couldn't use their own money, as that would constitute gambling. Herbert Stempel was the reigning champion, but he wasn't a crowd favourite. With his square attire and know-it-all attitude, leaving viewers turning off and tuning in to rival shows, much to the displeasure of Geritol, the main sponsor for 21. So, left wondering, what then to do with this Stempel failure? The word came down from Geritol that this Stempel must lose. Sorry, can't pass up a good superstar segue. The young Van Doren, an attractive, soft-spoken academic, was found as the foil for Stempel, and their 21 duel was nearing an end. Which brings us back to the episode from earlier. The category is Movies and Movie Stars. Wagering 5 points, a correct answer would net Herbert the win. What motion picture won the Academy Award for 1955? Do you need some extra time to think about it? Despite knowing the correct answer was Marty, it was even his favourite movie, Stempel answers, I sure do, appearing to be in deep thought for several seconds. He finally mumbles out an answer. Dejectedly, almost unwilling, he states, On the waterfront? This was not only the beginning of the end for Herbert Stempel, eventually being defeated and booted from the show next week, but also the beginning of the end for 21. Charles Van Doren had done it. He was now the reigning champion, crowd favourite, and Geritol was beyond happy. He had charisma and charm that Stempel hadn't. Albert Freeman, producer of 21, stated in a later interview, "Word of mouth spread with this guy, and by the time he left the show, they literally had sold an ungodly number of television sets in the United States. He should be thanked by the television makers and television networks." But what goes up must come down. And on this day, back in 1957, after a 3-month reign on 21, Charles Van Doren lost. Having won a total of $129,000, or just shy of 1.5 million USD today. He was hired by American television network NBC to be a White House correspondent and occasional host on the Today Show. So, that should be the end of our story for today. But I bet you're wondering, why did Herbert Stempel give the wrong answer to a question he knew? Well, that's quite simple. The whole thing had been rigged from the beginning. Well, nearly the beginning. Episode 1 was genuine, but Geritol were unhappy with the long pauses, the stammers, and lack of excitement the game show premiere had brought in September 12, 1956. So they demanded the next episode be better, or else. So, producers of the show, Dan Enright and Albert Friedman, found the application from Stempel and ran with a plan that Fox News would use decades later to worm their way out of a lawsuit. Reality? No. This is entertainment, baby. Stemple, angry at having been forced out, told to take a dive, started trying to bring the cheating scandal to light. But he was ignored, seen as a sore loser. Evidence of cheating at another game show, Dotto, soon brought Stemple's allegations back to light, and they were backed up by another former contestant, James Snodgrass, who had written the answers down from his coaching sessions and mailed them off to himself before taping. The date on the mail predating the taping was the smoking gun needed to show once and for all that 21 was rigged. Charles Van Doren even appeared at a Congress hearing surrounding the cheating scandals and revealed he had been complicit too. I asked Albert Friedman to let me go on honestly, without receiving help. He said that it was impossible. He told me that I would not have a chance to defeat Stemple because he was too knowledgeable. Continuing on, he says, he also told me that the show was merely entertainment, and that giving help to quiz contestants was a common practice and merely part of show business. This, of course, is not true. 21 was cancelled, and a new rule was added by the FCC for game shows that eventually just boiled down to no rigging the contests. Charles would lose his job at NBC, and eventually go on to become an editor of Encyclopedia Britannica, eventually writing a tell-all article titled All the Answers for the New Yorker, detailing his time on and after 21, before passing away in 2019. The perfect song pairing for this story, outside of my reference to This Jesus Must Die, is by punk rock band Rancid, from their album Rigged on a Fix and their song of the same name. A short song, but it does begin, Charles Van Doren never seemed to want it, a $64,000 question. Wednesday, 12th of March. On this day, not year, the silence of Sydney was broken by cries of murder. Redfern, Sydney. The suburb was named after William Redfern, a surgeon granted 100 acres of land by Lachlan Macquarie, our man with a currency plan from episode 7. No record on if Redfern paid in holy dollars and dumps. Over the years, Redfern's plot of land was divided more and more, merging with the city of Sydney in 1949. Today, the back streets of Redfern are narrow, from a time predating the prevalence of cars, and the terraced two-storied houses are crammed in together, allowing no privacy for the population, but also no easy escape for criminals. Our story dates back 100 years, to this very day, Wednesday the 12th, 1925. A little after 2 a.m. on this night, 25-year-old Cecil Aves awoke to a terrible scream, and had that been a gunshot? Rushing blindly through the dark house and its tight corridors, he made his way for the stairs, wanting to get down towards the scream. Mrs. Mary Smith and her daughter, Alice Quirk, were sleeping downstairs, and they always kept a candle burning in the night. That would help against all this darkness. As he was rushing down the corridor, a door creaked open. One of Mary Smith's young sons, Alan, 14, tentatively poked his head out, and Aves called for him to go back to bed and go to sleep. Finally, making the ground floor, Aves witnessed 2 men fleeing the room and running out the back door, a bloody tomahawk in one man's hand. Here, Cecil Aves was met with a choice: chase down the intruders, or find the source of the scream. Feeling he could do no good against 2 armed intruders, he made his way to the bedroom Mary and Alice shared, only to find his worst fears realized. Both women were lying in pools of spilling blood. Making his way out to the street, clad only in a singlet, he called out, "Quick, run for the police. There's been murder done." Disappearing back inside, he returned outside shortly after, now dressed, and called again, "Run for the police, for God's sakes! There's murder!" Gunshots rang out from the front of the house as a neighbour, seeing someone hidden on the roof, ordered them to stand and show themselves. With no reply forthcoming, and the screams of murder minutes old, he opened fire on the shadowy figure. Inside the house, on blood-soaked bedding, Mary Smith, wounds to her head, wasn't stirring, while Alice Quirk had suffered a larger variety of wounds. A cut across her hand had split a ring clean from it, with other axe blows evident across her body. A detective sergeant was the first to arrive, shortly after 2:30 a.m., and made this report. At 2:30 a.m., it was reported to the Redfern police that shots were being fired in Douglas Street, Redfern. When the patrol visited the house, they found Mary Smith, a married woman, living with her 2 children, apart from her husband, and Alice Quirk, her daughter, lying in a double bed in the front bedroom. Both were unconscious and bleeding profusely from wounds in the head. The bed was saturated with blood. An ambulance conveyed them to the Sydney hospital. Mary Smith died at 3:30 without regaining consciousness. Alice Quirk, 23, is in a critical condition. Search was made of the premises, and in the laundry to the rear a tomahawk was found with bloodstains and hair on it. Footprints were found in the flower bed, and these have been preserved. The report concluded that the stepfather, Mrs. Smith's partner, had objected to Cecil Aves staying in the house, and had taken his 2 daughters and moved away. The last conversation with Mrs. Smith, 6 weeks ago, had been terse. The tomahawk was found, as stated, in the laundry, with the handle cracked from the force of the blows, but the axe head had been wiped clean, or at least an attempt had been made at it. A bloody shirt was later found in Aves' room when the house was searched, while the shadowy figure on the roof had been Alan, the brother. After returning to his room, shared with his younger 5-year-old brother, they became scared, climbed out the window, and onto the roof. Thankfully, the shots fired at them had just been blanks, but from their vantage on the roof, they did see a curious sight in the garden. A man standing in the yard, tomahawk in one hand, cloth in the other, before he returned inside the house. Over the next few days, Alice Quirk remained in a coma. She wasn't expected to survive her injuries. However, as each day passed, Alice clung to life, and slowly but surely she began to get better. Finally, in early April, she was strong enough and ready to answer questions. Police hoped with her testimony they could put the missing pieces together and put the criminals, or criminal, behind bars. Finally, at an inquest held in May, Alice was able to tell her side of the story. Cecil Aves had wanted to marry Alice, asking on more than one occasion for her hand, and each time being rebuffed by Alice. Cecil got it in his head that Mary Smith was to blame for the rejections, stating, "Your mother is putting you up to say it," it meaning no. "Only for her you would marry me." That night of March 12th, Alice awoke to find a man, she believed to be Cecil, standing above her and Mary. Covering her head to fall back asleep was the last thing she remembered before waking up in Sydney Hospital. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't the last. The figure the brothers had seen in the yard that night had been Cecil Aves, shirt in hand, desperately using it to wipe at the blood on the tomahawk, before seemingly catching sight of the voyeurs and rushing back inside. A court case was held in early July, Cecil sticking to his story of the 2 intruders, but too many inconsistencies were now stacked up against it. The testimony of Alice and the brothers, the blood on his shirt, a policeman even remembered blood on his hands, despite him not having touched the bodies. Plus, no neighbour witnessed 2 people scrambling through the backyards fleeing their crime. Cecil was found guilty, and for his crime, sentenced to death. a punishment he appealed down to life in prison. Alice would appear in the newspapers again a year later. Having never recovered from her assault and suffering from terrible headaches, she was to have an X-ray to search for bone fragments in her skull. As for after that, who can say? Hopefully she fell back into obscurity, able to live her life on her own terms. What a story to try and pair a song with. Honestly, I don't think really much matches the terror and cruelty dished out by Cecil Aves in this story, or the resilience of Alice Quirk. But the best offering I can put forward is a pairing in Foxcry by Rabbitology, a song about the fear many modern women still fear at the hands of men, something that, unfortunately, hasn't changed in the 100 years since Alice Quirk was attacked in her house. Thursday, 13th of March. On this day, not year, if you were counting sheep in this valley, you would be dead to the world. Skull Valley, Utah, a 45-minute drive out of Salt Lake City, and likely named by settlers after remains of a previous skirmish between Indians had left human skeletons scattered across the location. While this vast, uninhabited area is a seemingly dry desert, it is also home to a number of life-giving springs and oases that dot the valley, draining off into the nearby Great Salt Lake. While not great for settlement, this land was perfect for ranching, and was, for the purpose of today's story, home to flocks of sheep. That wasn't all in the area, however. Located just 67 miles or 107 kilometers south of Skull Valley, past the abandoned Mormon town of Eosapa, previously populated by immigrants from New Zealand, Hawaii, Samoa, where now all that remains is a graveyard. Continuing along Skull Valley Road, you reach the military town of Dugway, home to the Dugway Proving Grounds. If you can remember back to episode 3, we talked of the Nevada Proving Grounds and their atomic attraction. Well, Dugway was similar, but they were proving, a far more sinister weapon of war, biological and chemical. Established in 1942, during World War II, Dugway tested a number of weapons, as per Wikipedia. Dugway Proving Grounds tested toxic agents, flamethrowers, chemical spray systems, biological warfare weapons, fire bombing tactics, antidotes for chemical agents, and protective clothing. As with Nevada and their mock nuclear villages, Dugway also set up mock Nazi German towns to practice and hone these tactics in an urban setting. Although the Geneva Convention of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical warfare after the horrors of World War I, it didn't prevent a country from testing such weaponry. During the Cold War and Vietnam War era, stockpiling such weapons was becoming common practice, as well as testing new and improved agents. Which is where our story finds us today. Skull Valley, 1968, March 13th. Dugway Proving Grounds had 3 biological weapon tests on this day. Firing a chemical artillery shell, burning nerve agent in an open-air pit, and the test of a jet spraying 320 gallons of a nerve agent over an unoccupied area west of Skull Valley. The tests concluded, and everyone went about their day. March 14th, the day after. Sheep in Death Valley began dying in their hundreds. Soon, thousands. By the end of the week, over 6,400 sheep would have mysteriously perished. Witnesses described it as a sea of dead animals and patches of white as far as the eye can see. Despite the coincidental timing and the nearness of the testing, the army claimed they were definitely not responsible and that the Dugway tests were safe. Only this wasn't the case. The sheep were tested, The land tested, the water and the plants all tested. The United States Public Health Service announced that tests have isolated a compound in snow, water, sheep blood, sheep liver tissues, and in grass taken from sheep's stomach, which is identical to the agent applied by the Army for comparative tests. The chemical found was that of Agent VX. Odorless and tasteless, only 10 milligrams is required to kill a human, as it paralyzes respiratory muscles, denying oxygen as the victim slowly starves for air, falling unconscious before death takes them. It turned out that the nozzle responsible for ejecting the nerve agent spray had malfunctioned. Instead of shutting off after the test had concluded, it continued to spray the agent out as the F-4 Phantom fighter returned back to base, trailing a deadly substance behind it. A rain of poison that went where the wind willed and winded up blown in a southwesterly direction, across Skull Valley, towards Salt Lake City. Fortunately, it never made it that far, and as far as I can tell, not a single human casualty was caused, but this didn't spare the poor sheep the nerve agent found in its path. So, what came from this accident? Well, the rancher who owned the majority of sheep was paid a hefty sum by the military, $376,000, about 3.4 million USD today, and he was also lent a bulldozer to help dispose of the sheep. Richard Nixon would go on to ban the testing of all open-air chemical weapons in 1969, the year after this incident. It would also go on to help inspire Stephen King's novel, The Stand, and George C. Scott film, adored by Quentin Tarantino, Rage. Back to another Kate Bush song for the pairing for this story. From the Ninth Wave concept album, the B-side to Hounds of Love, with the song And Dream of Sheep. A song telling of a lone person lost at sea, struggling to survive. It has an interesting parallel to our story above, as the sheep succumb to the nerve gas. Let me be weak, let me sleep, and dream of sheep. Friday, the 14th of March. On this day, not year, was the birth of a top 10 list you wouldn't want to feature on. In 1949, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, Shirley Temple fanboy, and gifter of novelty pens, was discussing with a reporter new ways to highlight dangerous criminals, the toughest guys that needed to be brought in. It was Hoover's 25th year as director, and amid rumours of his coming resignation and calls for the investigations into FBI practices, the article would be a shining light for Hoover and the FBI as a whole. Printed in the Washington Daily News, the full-page article showed 10 headshots of wanted criminals, their names and a description of them. To quote the article, the FBI picks up an average of 9,000 fugitives a year. Here are the names, pictures and records of 10 more the FBI would like particularly to include in the 1949 quota. The popularity of this article would prompt the FBI, on this day in 1950, to release their own 10 most wanted list. In true Letterman top 10 fashion, it also looks like they released a new name for the list over the next 10 days. From the 14th to the 24th of March, a new fugitive was added to the list. Although the FBI stresses that there isn't a ranking or order to the top 10, answering the FAQ question of, are members of the 10 most wanted fugitive lists ranked? With a simple one-word answer, no. The first 10 names to appear on the list were Thomas James Holden, Morley Vernon King, William Raymond Nesbitt, Henry Randolph Mitchell, Omar August Pinson, Lee Emroy Downs, Aubrey Elmore Haxon, Glenroy Wright, Henry Harlan Shelton, and Morris Goralnik. Also listed at spot number 11 on the FBI.gov website is the star of our story from last week, William Francis Sutton, aka Willie the Actor. To have gained a spot on this list, as per the FBI.gov website again, the individual must have a lengthy record of committing serious crimes and or be considered a particularly dangerous menace to society due to current criminal charges. Second, it must be believed that the nationwide publicity afforded by the program can be of assistance in apprehending the fugitive, who, in turn, should not already be notorious due to other publicity. Of the 10 names that reached the right notoriety and menace to appear, the first caught was the third entry, William Raymond Nesbitt. Added 16th of March 1950, he was caught 18th of March 1950, although this wouldn't end up being the shortest time a name had been on the list, with Billy Austin Bryant in 1969 being caught just 2 hours after his name was added. In fact, of the original 10, all but 1 were caught by the end of 1951. The next few decades would see at least 1 top 10 fugitive from the list caught each year, up until 1993, which became the first year none of the listed criminals were caught. As per the FBI.gov website, up to March 6, 2025, 535 individuals have appeared on the top 10 list, and of them 496 have been found. As for the most recent entry, that belongs to Ryan James Wedding, added on March 6, 2025, and wanted for running an international drug smuggling operation. If you can provide a tip that leads to his capture, or anyone still at large on the list, you could be eligible for a bounty of up to $250,000. I was thinking of a couple of songs for this pairing. The Clash's I Fought the Law, or maybe Public Enemy No. 1 from Anything Goes. But they just didn't seem to fit quite right in my mind. Something that finally did sit right was One Way or Another. Originally by Blondie in 1978, however, after listening to numerous cover versions, I think, for me at least, the cover by the punk band The Coathangers just beats out the original, and so takes my pairing for this story. One Way or Another by The Coathangers. Saturday, 15th of March. On this day, not year, land ho! Or should that be land? No. Benjamin Morel, born 1795 in New York, was the son of a shipbuilder, and the call of the sea was strong in him. At age 17, he had already dropped out of school and ran off to become a sailor. Unfortunately, he did so right in the middle of a war, the War of 1812, and was almost immediately caught by the British. He was released again after 8 months, went back to sea, and was once again caught by the British. Spending the night below deck under guard, the next morning, July 4th came, and the English captain let the Americans come up to drink and celebrate, in the memory of the immortal George Washington. His second capture would see him imprisoned in Dartmoor Prison back in England for 36 months, and the remainder of the war. Getting back to sailing, it was likely, due to his unfinished education, that he would ever become an officer. However, a captain would take pity on him and eventually forward his education enough for Morel to make officer. And then, in 1823, he advanced to captain of his own ship. His ship, the Wasp, was to sail to the area around the Southern Ocean, both for exploration and to hunt for seals. Wasp, her crew and Morel reached Beauvais Island, an incredible feat as it is known as the world's most remote island and had only been seen 2 times before and never landed on. Morel wrote of the island, "This island is evidently of volcanic origin, even the rocks having been melted by former eruptions into a complete mass of lava, presenting the appearance of blue and green glass. There are some spots of vegetation on the hillsides. Continuing their voyage eventually found them on this day in 1823. Morell wrote, "On Saturday, March 15th, at 2 p.m, land was seen from the masthead, bearing west, distance 3 leagues. At 4:30 p.m, we were close in with the eastern coast of the body of land, to which Captain Johnson had given the name of New South Greenland." It's not noted anywhere, but we can presume that Captain Robert Johnson, a former captain of the Wasp, must have told of an island he had discovered in a previous journey aboard the Wasp. Now Captain Benjamin Morell had been able to rediscover and chart the island of New South Greenland, sometimes called Morrell's Land. Morell wrote of the island, "This land abouts with oceanic birds of every description. We also saw about 3,000 sea elephants, and 150 sea dogs and leopards. But they didn't stay for long. On Wednesday, the 19th of March at 10 o'clock p.m, we bade adieu to the cheerless shores of New South Greenland." On his return to America in 1824, Morell finds his wife and children have died, promptly marries his 15-year-old cousin, and details of New South Greenland are shared, and its location put on maps. Which is where the issue really begins, outside of the marriage to his underage cousin. Future visits to this location couldn't find the island Benjamin Morell had described. Considering he had charted more than 560 kilometres of its coastline, it shouldn't be difficult to miss. For nearly 100 years after, ships sailed the area described by Morell, only to find nothing. Even Sir Ernest Shackleton, as late as 1915, found his ship trapped in ice around the location described, and looked, only to find nothing. So, what was going on? Had the island vanished? Sunk back beneath the icy sea like some modern-day Atlantis? Well, nobody can know for sure, but some likely theories probably give a fairly accurate account. First, it's worth noting that our friend, Captain Morell, was a bit of a braggart. Remember that island he was only the third to see, Beauvais Island, and his description of the volcanic rock? Well, it turns out the island is covered, year-round, by a layer of ice, a detail absent in Morell's recollection. Next, many of the positions given by the good captain, charting the seas the Wasp sailed, would put the ship directly over Antarctica. So it's entirely possible that Morell either wasn't the best navigator or just fudged the numbers occasionally. He would do the same for distance too, once recording a voyage of 900 miles covered in just 4 days. Speeds unheard of for that time. So, given the braggart nature and his failings in navigation, it is thought by people today that Captain Morell did indeed sight land, just not where he thought it was. It's possible that the Wasp was sailing around the eastern coast of Graham Land, a tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, which had only been discovered 3 years prior to Captain Morell in 1820. Either way, this meant that the recorded New South Greenland, as noted down on maps, had become something known today as a phantom island. Errors, inconsistencies, or sometimes even deliberate sabotages reported by sailors and recorded down by cartographers. Australia even has its own phantom island in Sandy Island. Reported by Captain James Cook in the 1700s, the island survived up until the digital age, finding its way onto Google Maps. A scientific vessel, noting the discrepancy of Sandy Island appearing on some maps but not others, sailed to and through its location, proving once and for all its phantom island status. It was removed from Google Maps in 2012. As for a song pairing, How can I go past Phantom Island by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard? Sunday, 16th of March. On this day, not year, a sick wife goes missing. But was it really Bridget Cleary that vanished? Or was something more sinister going on? Today, our story finds us in Ireland, specifically in and around County Tipperary and the towns of Clonmel and Ballyvadley. Clonmel is thought to have derived its name from an old Irish word meaning honey meadow, and was named such for the richness of the soil surrounding the town. It wasn't the only richness present in Clonmel. The town was steeped in a rich ancient history, and, more importantly for our story, ancient beliefs. But more on that later. Bridget Boland, born 1869, married Michael Cleary in 1887, at the age of 18 to his 27. And to all outsiders, they appeared to have an ideal life. Bridget Cleary was a dressmaker by trade. She always stood out with her sense of fashion, and earned extra money on the side, selling eggs from the flock of chickens she kept. Michael, meanwhile, was a cooper, and making a good living himself. Looking after Bridget's elderly father had even entitled them to one of the best houses in Ballyvadley. So, from the outside, all appeared perfect. But internally, trouble may have been brewing. Despite being married for over 8 years in 1895, they spent much of their early marriage living apart. Michael working in Clonmel, visiting Bridget in Ballyvadley on weekends. The couple also remained childless, which was a very unusual thing for those days. There's also some suggestion that Michael may have resented the independent lifestyle that Bridget led, earning her own money, taking long walks around the country to deliver eggs, and also her friendship with neighbouring farmers. One day, early March in 1985, after a long walk around the countryside delivering eggs to a distant relative, perhaps enjoying the exercise in the brisk spring weather, maybe even stopping off to view the fairy fort on a local nearby hill, Bridget arrived home late and awoke the next day ill. For days she was cared for by her husband, seen to eventually by a doctor, before a priest was ultimately called for. Then, on this day, March 16th, she vanished. But police had heard whispers of something more sinister happening. Murder. Searching for a body, they eventually discovered the badly burned Bridget Cleary in a shallow grave on the 22nd of March. But that burned and buried body was not Bridget, at least according to her husband, her father, and many family, friends, and neighbours who had been present at her demise. It was an impostor of supernatural origins. A changeling. A changeling, as per Wikipedia, is a human-like creature found through much of European folklore. A changeling was a substitute left by a supernatural being when kidnapping a human being. Changelings, according to legend, could be startled out of their impostor by confusing them, causing them to shout out. One method was to brew a tea of eggshells, or by tricking them into revealing themselves. They were also, as per the legends, deathly afraid of fire. While passing by the fairy fort all those days ago, it was thought that the being who had walked away wasn't Bridget, but a changeling. A thought reinforced when Michael Cleary sought help not from the doctor, but instead a local Shanahy, a historian, a storyteller, someone who was well versed in the legends of Ireland, a man by the name of Jack Dunn. Jack took one look at Bridget and knew what the problem was, an accusation Michael was only too happy to agree with. So, from the 14th to the 15th of March, with her husband, father, and other family and friends gathered around the sick and confused Bridget, they began performing the acts to drive the changeling away, and have the real Bridget Cleary returned. Ultimately, this would lead to Michael, in a frenzy, dousing her in oil and lighting his wife alight, ending her suffering and torture from over the previous days in one of the cruelest ways possible. All the while, Michael was telling those gathered that the changeling would go up in the chimney and his wife would be returned. So confident was he that they even gathered at the fairy fort that night, black-handled blades in hand, ready to cut Bridget free as the changeling procession entered the supernatural grounds. Of course, no procession arrived. Bridget Cleary never returned home. She had been there all along. Rather than her being a changeling, she had been the one surrounded by monsters. Something the courts also agreed on, as Michael Cleary, found guilty for the murder of his wife, was sentenced to 20 years in jail. Between this and the Redfern tragedy, there's been some heavy topics this week. Again, it's another one that is difficult to find a song pairing for. But perhaps the most fitting is the haunting retelling of her story by Edel Meade, with her simply titled, A Song for Bridget Cleary. Now, how closely have you been paying attention? Let's find out! Question 1. What was the radio play? The one that saw a charge of treason brought against Axis Sally. Question 2. Who was the sponsor for 21 that ultimately led the producers to rig the show? Question 3. What year did the Redfern axe murder take place? Question 4. What was one of the works inspired by the Skull Valley story? Question 5. What was the first year no fugitives on the FBI's most wanted list were caught? Question 6. New South Greenland is now thought to be a phantom island, but what was the name of Australia's own phantom island? And question 7. What professions did Bridget Cleary practice to earn her own money? And the answers. The radio play was called Visions of Invasion. Answer 2. The sponsor for 21 was Geritol. Answer 3. The Redfern murders took place in 1925. Question 4. The works inspired by the Skull Valley story were the novel The Stand and the movie Rage. Question 5. 1993 was the first year no fugitives were caught from the list. Question 6. Australia's Phantom Island is called Sandy Island. And the answer to question 7, Bridget Cleary was a dressmaker and sold eggs. So, how did you do? Had you been paying close enough attention? Which brings us to the end of another episode. I know I've stated it before, but I'm no historian. All these stories I try and research the best I can in the time I have, but odds are mistakes will slip through occasionally. No prize for doing so, but if you do spot anything I've gotten very wrong, please email me at thisdaynotyear@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate the podcast, or if you're feeling really proactive, share it with friends or a family member, or anyone you feel may enjoy our particularly chaotic adventure through the historical week ahead. Speaking of which, join me again next week for a look back at the history of the 17th to the 23rd of March. Until then, this has been another episode of TDNY. I've been Adam, and thank you for listening.